So, good afternoon to all, and sorry really for not being with you today, as I'm sure you're having interesting discussion and presentation during this conference. But thanks to IT facilities, I hope we'll be able to exchange and discuss on my presentation and more generally on the work we've been conducting here at the OECD on job quality. So I don't have the chair next to me to tell me how long I should speak, but I'm planning to talk for 20 to 25 minutes, as I guess a presentation by video recording like this may be a bit boring at one point. So basically my presentation will be structured around 6 points. So first, I will introduce you the OECD initiative on job quality, then present you the conceptual framework we've been developing at the OECD on job quality, provide you then with a statistical portrait, comparing emerging economies, but also comparing groups, socio-demographic groups. I will say also a few words on job quality and informality, taking also a dynamic perspective that is transition in and out informality, and finally provide you with some policy recommendations. So to start with, about the OECD initiative on job quality. So the premise of the work really was to bring job quality to the forefront of the policy debate on labor market performance. That is focusing on well-being outcomes, and that was very much inspired by the work done by the Stiglitz Sanfi2C report. Why job quality matters? Well, obviously, this is a key element of individual well-being. So in itself, it's an objective, it's an end, it's in own right. But also, job quality determines participation, worker commitment, and productivity. So this is also a means, a potential means to greater economic performance. Now, having said that, despite this growing attention in the international policy debate on the importance of job quality, this remains a complex topic to define and measure, mostly because of the multidimensional nature of job quality, but also because it was also difficult to provide an operational framework that is providing indicators that could be compared over time, but also across countries and groups. So the main contribution of this work, of this initiative, have been mostly both analytical and statistical. So analytical, the OECD developed a new framework for measuring job quality based on a set of indicators, and this produced 2 publications. The first framework developed was very much concentrated on OECD countries. So one of the challenge there was to extend this framework to emerging economies, and that will be really the basis of my presentation today. The second part of the analytical work was to also provide a dynamic perspective that really emphasizes on the prospects of careers, of people, professional careers. And the second part, so the statistical tools, was basically to develop a database on job quality that is going actually to be released early next year, early 2016. So, what makes a quality job? How can one define the different dimensions, how to select them, as to define the framework? So, the dimensions that we've been selected have been defined as the one which were essential for well-being. So job quality refers to those aspects of employment that, that's the slide I wanted to show you. So job quality is multidimensional and refers to those employment characteristics that are likely to contribute to workers' well-being. So drawing both, again, on the Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi report, but also on the evidence provided by the literature on the topic, we identified three key pillars, three complementary key dimensions of job quality. The first one relates to earnings quality, and this refers basically to the job contribution, to employment contribution to the material living standard of workers. And it's defined in terms of its level, but also in terms of its distribution, as both dimensions matters for well-being. The second dimension relates to labor market security, and it relates to the risk workers are likely to face in the labor market and to the consequences of this risk, whether this is a risk of unemployment or the risk of falling into extreme poverty, the consequence for the workers and for its family. I'm going to come back on that dimension when presenting the statistical portrait for that dimension. As you can already see, this additional risk we had to consider as a major risk for emerging economies was obviously not so much the risk of unemployment, because as you know perfectly, most of the people cannot simply afford to be unemployed in countries such as India or Indonesia, etc. So the main risk for those people is really the risk of falling into extreme poverty. And the third dimension is the quality of the working environment, which captures the non-economic aspects of jobs, that is, relates to the nature, to the content of the work performed, working time arrangement, workplace relationship, etc. Very quickly on, sorry, because I lost my mouse. Okay, so just a sort of illustration to recap what I just described, that is how all this literature on well-being, and also at the OECD we develop also a well-being agenda, mostly structured on the basically two key dimensions, so the material living condition and the quality of life. And just to show how are here three dimensions, so earnings quality, work environment, and labor market security, connect with the well-being agenda and frameworks. This is also another synthetic chart to basically illustrate that labor market performance, as you can see here, should not only be assessed in terms of quantity, that's the usual employment, unemployment, or even underemployment indicators, but also in terms of its quality, and that ultimately all this, I mean, the ultimate objective here that we are trying to pursue is to enhance well-being outcomes. So a last word on this conceptual work developed here. We also followed three guiding principles to develop our indicators. Again, very much inspired by the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report. And those three principles are the following. The first one is to concentrate on outcomes experienced by workers. That is, the point is not so much to assess the drivers of job quality, but really the outcomes for the people. So, for example, instead of looking at employment protection legislation, we consider the real security that workers are likely to experience. The second principle is to concentrate on individual workers. That is, we mostly use micro data, and this is really to be able to assess inequalities and have all this information on distribution, so go beyond the average. And the third principle is to concentrate, to focus on objective features and measures. And this is really to ensure a better comparability of outcomes across countries. So, for example, data such as job satisfaction are not considered in this operational framework. So in terms of statistical portrait and the type of cross-country comparison we came up, and I forgot to mention that actually most of my presentation is based on the chapter 5 of the Employment Outlook 2015 on job quality in emerging economies. So if you want also to get and have more detail and information. And by the way, I hope you have the handout also to follow my presentation. This probably makes the presentation smoother to follow. So first looking at earnings quality. So as explained previously, so we looked both at the average, but also at the distribution. So to have a sort of sense of inequalities, because both matter for the well-being, for life satisfaction of people. So what you have here is basically so the composite index, so that look both at the average and the distribution. And what you can see, so this is for a set of 12 emerging economies for which data were available. And you can see that earnings quality show considerable variation, of course, across emerging economies. First of all, overall earnings quality is much lower than the OECD average. That's the blue bar completely on the right, which is not so surprising. And the second point here I would like to make as well is actually this earnings quality is characterized by both a combination of very low average earnings, but also a very high earnings inequality. And that's what you can see here. I don't know if you can see that, the arrow here, the different points plotted here. In terms of differences across countries, so you have countries on the one hand with the highest earnings quality, and those are countries such as here on the right, Argentina, Chile or Russia, and the countries with the lowest earnings quality, of which India, together with Indonesia or Colombia. Now, quickly going to the second dimension, and as I briefly explained before, so what we added or what we extended in terms of better capturing labor market insecurity in emerging economies, because again, as I said before, while for OECD countries the major risk is really the risk of becoming unemployed, but also of staying unemployed. So that was the indicator developed for OECD countries in our framework. That is the risk of falling into unemployment, and also once you are unemployed, the type of insurance in place in the different countries to cushion this sort of, to buffer this loss of income due to unemployment. I mean, obviously for the majority of emerging economies, this is not the major risk. Being unemployed is really something that people cannot afford in the majority of emerging economies. So the main risk is really the risk of falling into very low pay. So here, what you have on this chart is basically the overall risk. That is both risks need to be considered because, for example, in countries still such as South Africa, right, or Turkey, which belong to this group of countries studied here, unemployment is also a major risk. So we have the combination of the two risks. And what you can see again on the left here is that overall labor market insecurity exceeds the OECD average, which is again plot on the right. And the insecurity for extreme low pay tends to drive, and that's the light blue bar, tends to drive the overall insecurity in poorer countries. So that's typically the case here of India and Indonesia. But again, some variation between countries. Finally, the third dimension, which in a way is sort of the most innovative of this framework, and which is the quality of the working environment. So here, what we developed again in the original framework was an indicator of job strain. That is the percentage of people who were experiencing a job strain. A job strain being defined by a job where you have a certain amount of demand linked to that job, such as time pressure, or it's really demanding. So in terms of physical activities and the impact it may have on health. But at the same time, you have also resources at your disposal. That is, for example, the level of autonomy you can have to do your job and your task, the access to learnings, the fact that you may have good workplace relationships, such as being a good manager, providing good feedbacks, or also having supportive colleagues, etc. So these models, which have been developed by occupation and health specialists, but also by psychologists, etc. Actually, the premise of this model is the imbalance between demand and resource that may create ultimately health problems. So physical, but also mental health problems. So obviously, it was quite difficult to use such models for emerging economy for two reasons, basically. First one was that there was a question of access to data. Simply data were not available in the majority of those countries. But the second also reason was in countries, again, with high informalities and also where self-employment is quite widespread. Well, it is not obvious to see whether those models and those indicators, percentage of job strain, is something that is the most relevant. So what we used in for those countries, we actually again used two indicators. So one possible. We also calculated the job strain indicator, but we also used as a complementary indicator the share of people working very long hours. And what we define as very long hours was people working over 60 hours a week. And here, so that's actually what is displayed on this chart. You can see that working very long hours in emerging economies is much more common than in a typical OECD countries, which is displayed here on the blue light bar. Of course, this is not a fully satisfactory indicator. I mean, one could argue that some people are very happy to work very, very long hours. So this is kind of a choice, and therefore maybe not such a good proxy for assessing the quality of the working environment. So in a way, it is true, but it could be also that you're very happy to work long hours. Doesn't mean that it's also good for your health and for your well-being. So what I'm trying to say here is also depends on which well-being outcomes you are looking at. Okay, now a final slide on comparing actually job quality by groups. So what you have here are actually different panels along the different dimensions. So that those are cross-country averages, and provide figures so by gender, so for men and women. Then by age groups, so 3 categories, and finally by level of education. So not surprisingly, as you can see also here, well, job quality tends to be lower for women. I mean, notably in terms of earnings quality and overall labor market insecurity. The other category, vulnerable categories, are obviously the young people and the low-skilled workers. So coming now to sort of second big part of my presentation, which is to connect this also with informality, and whether or not like informal jobs would be worse jobs. So again, the sort of premise of the study we conducted here was not to define ex ante informal jobs as bad jobs. Of course, it's quite important to sorry, I was looking for my mouse. Okay. Yeah. So why care about informality? Well, of course, no need to, I think, to make the case for much for this in this audience. But obviously, informality is important because it represents an important share of total employment. And here you have so some figures for 2011. So for employees and also for self-employed. And you can see that for India, well, this is a very high share. So it is important, but also it's important in terms of policy concern. I mean, it has obvious implication both in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of equity. So how do we define informality in this study? Well, those are basically salaried workers who are not affiliated to social security, so they not pay contribution, plus also the self-employed whose business is not registered. So using this definition, what we conducted, so okay, I'm going to skip this slide, as this is something also probably you are quite familiar with, right? I mean, this again, the view of informality, the sort of positive, optimistic view versus the pessimist one, and this is actually why very much we took that perspective of, well, we don't judge ex ante whether it's good or not to be in informal jobs, or whether those jobs would be good or bad jobs. So coming to this sort of comparing along, I mean, using our framework and comparing the quality of formal and informal jobs, and again along the same 3 dimensions, well, you can see quite clearly that informal workers tend to earn less. That's what you can see on the left panel. They face considerably higher labor market insecurity, and they work very long hours more often. So overall, the quality of informal jobs is low, Now, the other thing, the other point we wanted to make in the chapter also, so in terms of quality outcomes, informal jobs perform like worse, but what about in terms of, perspective and dynamic? So what we wanted to look at is basically those transition in and out informality, that is, assess to which extent being in informal jobs would leave you with a scaring effect, and also to which extent those jobs would be stepping stones or rather traps for workers. So here I should say that unfortunately the study we conducted, we could not cover India, so that's maybe some extent going to be to some extent less interesting or relevant for you, but I think it's quite worth to present you 2-3 slides on results here. So the first point here is to look at mobilities, so transition rates, so outflows from formal to different employment, formal and informal, but also labor market destinations, so including as well moving to unemployment or to out of the labor force, and also outflows from informal jobs. What you have here are basically so the transition for short spells, that's only 2 to 3 consecutive years. And we could conduct the study for 4 countries. It was urban China, urban Colombia, South Africa, and also Turkey. And the main point here is maybe have a look at the second panel downstairs that I would like to highlight, is to show that so where do people go once they leave informality? Well, the picture here is basically to say that if you compare to that one, which is basically the outflows from formal jobs, and here you can see a high persistence, of formal jobs, people in formal jobs stay in formal jobs, while here the picture is more mixed, and outflows from informality actually goes to different directions. So informal jobs are very, very unstable. There is, to some extent, some stepping stone here. So here you have the people going from informal jobs to formal jobs. So it's some stepping stone effects. But here you can see, so those are the outflows out of the labor force. And here this is the figure for South Africa, which is quite worrying, because you have a very high share of people simply discouraged, so leaving the labor market pool. The other point here, I think, which is quite interesting to make, is still when people manage to move from informal jobs to formal jobs, to which type of work do they go, of jobs? So that's trying to bring back this job quality perspective. And here we could split the analysis by contract types. So we could also separate the destination between fixed-term jobs and permanent jobs. And here, well, the results show a sort of potential vicious circle here, because what you have is informal workers tend to or are more likely to move to fixed-term jobs. So that's the first thing. But, and that's now this second part here of the second panel of this chart, is those fixed-term jobs. Once people are in fixed-term jobs, then they are more likely to move back to informality. So we have this sort of vicious circle for informal workers. And finally, while not displayed here, but we have those results in the chapter for those interested. We also found that in the Employment Outlook 2015, that if workers manage to escape informal jobs, well, this leads to higher earnings on average. So coming now to the policy. Sorry, I think there was a slight technical problem. So I was saying, coming now to the sort of policy recommendation we could sort of formulate, or maybe more in terms of general principles, because this is again a framework cross-country, etc. So one would need to go, of course, at country level and take into account the sort of cultural and also country specificities to formulate proper policy recommendations. But I think in light of what we found in the chapter, that is job quality tends to be lower in emerging economies compared to OECD countries along all dimensions. The identification of specific categories, vulnerable groups, such as young people or the low-skilled workers. The fact also that workers with informal jobs do worse along all the three dimensions defined in the framework, but also the fact that informality may leave important scars on people's careers. What we sort of build out in a sort of policy recommendation, as I was saying, along basically kind of three pillars. So policy to increase job quality in emerging economy, with that idea that labor market institutions, because we're talking here about having effective regulation but also social protection and active labor market policies. So labor market policy and institution could sort of be building blocks in the labor market as part of a development, economic development agenda. So should go all together hand in hand, and contribute to a better functioning of the labor market, which would also lead to economic development pattern. So unpacking a little bit more, I mean, the sort of previous table I was showing. So first of all, I mean, the first point is how to improve, if you want, the quality of existing jobs. So one of the things is to enhance the quality of those jobs through more effective social protection systems and labor laws. And of course, the spirit here, or the main point here, is to ensure to find this balance between the good balance between protection but also work incentives. For instance, this is particularly the case when or if introducing an unemployment benefit scheme. Well, define the parameters precisely to come up to this good balance. The second thing is to raise the effectiveness of labor regulations. By effectiveness, the point is to say when, again, defining the more specific parameters of the regulation, whether this is, we're talking about EPL, Employment Protection Legislation, or working time regulation, etc. The parameters have to be defined at the appropriate level as to be effective and enforced. The second sort of general principle is to help workers move to better quality jobs, because we had a sense of this sort of how important this dynamic aspect was. So help or assist workers find high quality jobs early in their careers. So this is obviously through strengthened education, training, apprenticeships, and active labor market policies. But also, it's quite important to design or reflect about those different schemes targeting particular groups in the labor market, and notably the low-skilled workers. Finally, and this sounds more like a familiar story probably for the audience here, is, of course, given this important share of informality and this association that was found between informality and low-quality jobs, part of the agenda is to reduce the share of low-quality jobs by curbing informality. And here, of course, the OECD has quite published extensively in previous Employment Outlooks editions about this topic. I mean, recognizing the benefits of formalization, both for enterprise, for firms, and for workers themselves, but also by lowering the cost of formality for employers and self-employed. And thirdly, work on the enforcement and the enforcement methods. Those have to be improved. Okay, I think I came at the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you. I hope you could have a good sense of what I wanted to say, despite this sort of technological gap between us. And I really look forward our discussion and also our exchange.